Yeah,
Right.
I think we're good.
Thank you, Marshall. You did sign up for this, but I appreciate it.
Yes.
You're a great explainer. That was impressive. That
Educator.
IT situation we had going on.
I've had to teach a patient management system to a room full of like 50 people, ages like 18 through 75.
Oh,
So you get to learn on, you pick out the pictures, people find the pictures eventually.
Marshall, good.
Yeah, I think we're good to go.
Great.
Wonderful panel. Good.
Yes. Good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Ben Hilskamp. I am the Executive Director of LOVEboldly, which along with our wonderful partners at Stonewall Columbus are the hosts and sponsors for this panel. I do just want to note for logistics, as you've seen us all bothering with tech, we do have some folks who are joining us via Zoom and may be asking some questions at the end along with any of you all. We also are live on Instagram for I think exactly 0 people, but that's fine. My comms coordinator is going to appreciate this when he gets that I did this. So in any case, for wherever the Reverend Brandon Robertson is, he's going to appreciate it. Anyway, we are so happy to be with you all. This is the first of hopefully 2 or 3 panels on the topic of the church working with the larger queer community and the queer community working with the church, and how or if those 2 groups, very broad groups, can come together to work on things that that matter to both groups. So to get us started, I'd like to ask my wonderful partners up here to introduce themselves. Let's do name, pronoun, and place in the community, however you want to define that. I think I've said all 3 of those already. So Josh, let's just go straight down the table.
Okay, so my name is Josh Culbertson, he, him pronouns. I work as an outpatient therapist. I do outpatient therapy groups at the Medical Center at Ohio State. And I also do private practice counseling through under the name Authentic Pathways. Alex?
Yes, my name is Alex Shanks. My pronouns are he, him, his. My place in the community is an interesting question, but I'll try not to talk for too long. I currently work as the Vice President of Programs at Equitas Health, but I am also an openly trans man, which means for me that I was raised as a woman and have since transitioned to live my life every day as the man that I've always known myself to be. And have worked kind of in and around LGBTQ nonprofits and the intersection between LGBTQ nonprofits and mostly the Christian church, but have also done some interfaith coordinating as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Boyer. My pronouns are they, them. I serve as the Director of Programs and Marketing here at Stonewall Columbus. So thank you to everyone who is here in our space today. This is what the space is for. So we really appreciate you coming by. Place in the community beyond that professionally. I am a trans person who is slowly finding myself into spaces of mentorship with other trans people, whether I choose to or not. So that just kind of just gets thrust upon you sometimes. Other than that, I am a recovered Pentecostal. So I get to have fun conversations with Ben about my perspectives and how faith still guides my life, whether I am an active participant in it or not. Recovered. ED. There is a period on that sentence.
I wonder if, and Alex and Zach both started moving this direction in their answers, but I wonder if any of us would like to kind of give our background as it relates to the church, to religion, given that that is a major piece of this discussion. I won't make everyone respond unless they want to, but if anyone would like to kind of kick that off, your background with the church or with religion.
So, okay, I guess I'll try to be as brief as possible. Hit just the highlights. So, church attendance for me as a young child was like kind of spotty. Went to a small little country Baptist church with my parents and grandparents growing up here and there, mostly CNE attenders with my parents, Christmas and Easter. Do have very vivid memories though, like I have two vivid memories. One was I was once, I participated, my mother took me to a vacation Bible school there. That was the first time I was introduced to the concept of, if you haven't done these things, you're going to hell. So I remember there being lots of tears and my mother trying to talk me down from that ledge. And then also I remember they had this lovely little like end times chart that was like embroidered and hung above the sanctuary. And so I have very vivid memories of this embroidered lake of fire. So like have some pretty few but very vivid visual memories of that time. And then later as an adult, when I was 20, I got involved in a non-denominational fundamentalist Pentecostal-ish type church that when I was wrestling with my own issues of sexuality and not wanting to be who I was because there was didn't appear to be a safe way to be that, were very helpful and letting me know that Jesus could fix that whole gay thing and we'll get rid of that. So I spent my 20s and early 30s in that, and then eventually found my way out of that and got connected to where I'm still a member of United Methodist Congregation here in Columbus. That is a reconciling congregation, which means open and affirming and supportive of LGBTQ people. And yeah, so, and now I'm also a graduate of the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. That's where my master's in counseling is from. That was important to me, that when clients and patients come to the therapy space with questions or issues of faith, that I be able to kind of walk that path with them and help them navigate those questions with some level of insight. So, right, stop there. Alex,
That was
do
a
you have
good
any,
sum.
do you have any experience with the church?
And the experience of the church, sure. Yeah. So my goodness. I'll go back a little ways as well, but also hit the high points and say that I grew up in a non-denominational, but really came from a Southern Baptist church. That truly ended up being, for me, quite a safe space, even as a young person. Heard lots of affirming things of people with differences. I won't say that we spoke a whole lot about LGBTQ identity or homosexuality or anything like that directly, but had a pastor who, in a denomination or related to a denomination that did not support women in ministry, had 5 daughters. And so he struggled himself with the rules of the church in that way, and that came through a lot. And without sort of going through each and every phase, as I sort of grew through life, I always found myself landing in supportive faith communities of whatever phase in life that I was in. I always felt very protected, in a somewhat divine way. And then I met my wife while working as a youth pastor who was out lesbian in Athens, Ohio, United Methodist Church. That wasn't openly reconciling, but ultimately was an affirming space, if I was their youth pastor and lesbian. But met my wife while I was there, who had a very different background as a Roman Catholic, wrestled a lot with her identity as a member of the LGBTQ community, did not have a positive and affirming sort of youth in the church. And I would say that somewhat defined kind of how we navigate religious spaces and spiritual spaces, both in our lives and in our sort of weekly routines. but faith has always remained really important to both of us. On a professional level, I've been, as I kind of mentioned, I started my career working in the United Methodist Church for the West Ohio Conference Office. Then I was a youth and young adults pastor in Athens. And then when I transitioned, we moved to Columbus. My now wife and I moved to Columbus, and I came out as trans. And that's when the church and I struggled. I was safe and protected and sort of ushered divinely through spaces up until I came out as trans and tried to find a job in Columbus in reconciling churches as youth pastor, associate pastor, any of those things. Knew I did not want to be ordained, but wanted to lead from a lay perspective, and could not find a place to land. And I remember very vividly a moment where I got my last kind of, sorry, we're not going to give you the job phone call from a reconciling church here in Columbus. And I lost it. Like, I just broke down completely. And I remember hearing a very clear, like, I don't feel like I hear God's voice in a really like direct, loud spoken way very often, ever really, except for that one time. But I mostly kind of feel God's presence, and it's a softer, more subtle experience for me. But in that moment, I heard God say to me, I don't want you to work in the church anymore. And my wife came upstairs and she was like, are you okay? Did somebody die? And I was like, kind of. It was like a whole moment. It was a whole moment. And from that point, I got just a couple of weeks later, someone called me for a job that I had applied for, working for the Reconciling Ministries, which is the organization that advocates around the United Methodist Church for LGBTQ inclusion, saying, I know you applied for this job. I happen to get it, but I don't want to finish my contract. Do you want to step in? And I was like, sure. And that really began my journey of advocating for LGBTQ inclusion in the church. First with Reconciling Ministries, and then with Equality Ohio as a faith consultant, eventually as their field director. That's where I met Josh, and we did a lot of work together. And then I kind of have just meandered my way into healthcare administration somehow. I don't know what's going on with my career, but that's really my relationship with the church. I don't know if you want to share anything else, but
I'm happy to, unless we want to move on for time. I feel like I spoke on this pretty heavily at another Love Boldly event, so I don't want to take up too much space. Okay, cool.
I also want to respond to this question.
Oh, love. Cool. So as I shared at the top, if you're just joining us, hi. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, not only just as a member, but my father is a minister. And my mother is a Sunday school teacher / the cleaning lady for the church. And my father was the secretary and the treasurer. So not only was it just a member of the congregation, we were there early to service. We were there late after service. We were there on Wednesdays for Wednesday service. We were there on Saturday to make sure that everything was ready to go for Sunday. And when the Spirit moved the minister and we had a revival, we were there all week. So it wasn't just a relationship with the church as a congregation member. Church was my entire childhood. I can remember there being many times where I would have to choose between something I wanted to do either through extracurriculars with school, or I had to make a decision that I had to choose the church. And of course, I wasn't making any decisions, so the church got chose. I've always kind of been confronted with femininity and queerness and my presentation growing up. So that was always kind of just either addressed in not the most affirming way, but in a way that there always was space for me within music. So I was heavily involved within the music production, and that makes it sound really, really intense. It was a single piano player and myself. I also would sing at funerals because my father was doing the service. So I sang at funerals, I sang at weddings, and I sang at anniversary parties. Those were my favorite. Because in my mind, in the process of hearing not only from a minister, fire and brimstone about queerness, it was my dad. So I thought, if I can use this gift. I'm not going to bury my gifts, my talents. So I did everything I could through music to try to out queer myself, which ended up being very queer because I sing very femininely. And then I made the decision that I was just going to stifle this and that I was just going to be a career person. So when I left for college, so this is all taking place in Southern Ohio, near Portsmouth, if you're familiar. So right on the river. I lost my accent on purpose. I ended up going to Capital here in Columbus, a Lutheran institution, and I thought I'm really going to immerse myself, and I joined a fraternity. Ended up being a co-ed Lutheran-based fraternity that once I joined, we all started coming out, so it became the genderless queer fraternity. But even in going to college, I was still running away from something and trying to envelop myself within faith to try to escape that. And I ended up finding a beautiful home amongst so many affirming, which I'd never experienced, affirming Christians at Capital and through my fraternity. So through trying to run away from faith, I ended up finding myself in a much deeper and more loving way. And something that I've shared in another LOVEboldly event is that as much as I've tried to, what I feel is pivot from the church, I see a lot of what my work is here at the center. And prior to this, my work within higher education was creating space for students and making sure that folks found community. And that's exactly the mission of Jesus. That's exactly the mission of what the essence of what my parents were doing through their dedication to the church, but just less of the judgment piece that at least I received from my upbringing. So as much as I try to escape faith and I try to escape that piece of myself, it's fundamental to who I am. And those values come through in unexpected, very queer ways now. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, if you'll indulge my response to my own question. So I grew up Roman Catholic here in Ohio, in Eastern Ohio, not as far south as Portsmouth, but still that kind of area. And I think what I noticed from a very early age is what we were taught, and I should say I attended K through 12 in Catholic schools as well. What we were taught religiously, theologically, often didn't line up with what we saw happen in our church, in our community. So we were often taught the Catholic social justice message, borderline liberation theology, but that's not what actually happened from the pulpit in our churches. Now, I loved church. I always have. I've always felt a call to ministry. And as a very in the closet, but not hiding it very well, young Catholic kid, loved fashion and loved the fashion of the church and the pageantry of the church that I got to see on a weekly basis. So I was very involved in the church. I told people I wanted to be a priest. Unfortunately, it was at a retreat for Catholic boys who were interested in the priesthood that I was sexually assaulted by a Catholic priest, which just loaded on the baggage with the church. Particularly the priest in question was one of those who was clearly gay, but was also very in the closet and harming LGBTQ folks through his own rhetoric, which just created a lot of dissonance for me. I went to college at an Episcopalian college, the University of South Swansea, Tennessee. I became Episcopalian there. And that's where, unlike many queer folks at the church, my church experience at Swanee was the chaplains there just said, "We love you. You're a child of God. God does not make trash. You are 100% wonderfully made." And instead of having a negative church experience, I had a really positive church experience. Now, my Catholic friends back home, some of them sent me death threats. But where I was, the church just enveloped me in love, enveloped me in support, reached out all the time, made sure that I felt welcomed and affirmed where I was. And while that didn't necessarily help my call to ministry per se, it kept me involved in the church. Like Zach, I worked in higher education for about 10 years. And then during the pandemic, happened to find this wonderful little nonprofit in Ohio that needed an ED who hopefully was queer. And I wanted a job working with a queer nonprofit in the church. And here I am with LOVEboldly. So my background with the church is nuanced with this call to ministry, and what does that mean? Nuanced with being queer, nuanced with this unfortunate history of sexual assault, but it nevertheless has overall been very welcoming to me, which again, I realize is a real privilege among LGBTQIA plus folks. So I want to thank my co-panelists here for sharing their stories. The reason that this panel came about, and the other panels we hope are going to be part of this series, is because Love Boldly has had more and more churches reaching out to us saying, we are progressive, or we're trying to be progressive. And as part of that, we want to reach out more to the queer community, but either we don't know how, or when we do, queer people don't show up and we don't know why. So I would like to pose it to our panel. What can churches that want to reach out, churches that want to do more with the queer community, where should they start? I realize that's a totally vague, loaded question, but I wonder if we can think of, where should they start? What should they know?
I'm happy to hop in. I think first is a recognition that there are thousands of years of not just hypotheticals, but there's a history of persecution from the church directly toward queer people. And I think that though you might have had the last decade or two to be affirming and to be reconciling, I think that there is an acknowledgement that needs to take place that these aren't hypotheticals. We have been persecuted by the church. So there is some trauma that comes with that generationally, whether that is through biological families or just through queer community. We all experience some type of religious trauma. So I think you need to acknowledge that. And as many rainbow flags as you might put out, at the same time, that doesn't fix the issues that some of us have with white Jesus. So I think that acknowledgement is first and foremost of stop viewing us as another market to corner and to say like, well, we've created space, why aren't they here? I think you need to acknowledge like, hey, some people just are never going to be there.
I would agree with that. I think my first thought was you have to recognize the trauma that exists and take a really trauma-informed approach to how we as a church and we as a queer community can rebuild relationship. So, and to your point, some folks are going to struggle more than others based on their own experience with trauma and trauma directed by the church to trust again. I'm not even going to call it forgive, because there is an element of forgiveness in moving on and living your life, but to trust that the church won't hurt you again is probably for me and for my family, I want to say is one of the hardest components. We as a unit and myself, I mentioned one moment of hurt, but I would say probably the worst moment of hurt that I've experienced in the church is when a reconciling pastor told me that they would not marry me and my wife, because what he was saying to me in that moment was that, from my perspective, protecting the building from whatever denominational wrath might come, protecting the building, protecting the pension, and on top of it, I think the other component that was really difficult for me was that the members of the board, the pastor said, the board will not let me. Sorry. Here's a list of other pastors who might, even though you've been attending here for however, it was like 2 years at that point. The board won't let me, sorry. Here's a list of other pastors who might. The board was made up of a bunch of queer people. And so that's where I kind of started to experience that dissonance between like, we're sick, like as an organization, as a community, in relationship with the church. That's some twisted abuse, to have a bunch of Like I just couldn't like make sense of it. It just didn't make any sense to me. And that harm is the harm that really led to me no longer attending the church on a regular, like attending church or building community inside of church buildings regularly. So the trauma for me, am I able to kind of forgive and trust some of those folks again? Yes. Is my wife? Absolutely not. No, I don't know that she ever will, really. She'll go to church if I want to go to church, but if I don't want to go to church, she doesn't really. You know, we talk about church, we pray together, we have we're raising our family in a way that is there is a spiritual foundation and a religious one and a Christian one, but it's not connected to the church as an institution anymore.
Yeah, well, I think this is a multi-layered question, because I think churches were struggling to draw people, particularly young people, before we had a global pandemic. Now I think that struggle is like obviously is compounded more. And then, yes, also you throw in that if one of the populations you're trying to attract is a population that has been traditionally, historically traumatized and marginalized through the work that you do, that is, yeah, it just adds a whole extra layer. Because I agree, I think there are many people, you know, I hear the same, like, we're here, why aren't they coming? Like, well, I don't think they're looking for you. So I don't think they're sitting out there thinking, oh my gosh, if there was only a church I could go to. So I think it is overall, it's the same question of like, how do you market anything? Like, how do you get in front of the eyeballs that you want to get in front of? And how do you make your product something that the consumer wants to take off the shelf? And I think that I don't know. I don't know if we're going to see, I know that there are also, churches are not all the same, right? Some folks have been really, really hurt by some churches, some congregations, some individuals within churches. But I think for the average person standing out there, it's difficult to tell. I am a member of the congregation that I'm a member of now, largely because of like seeing them march in a pride parade and learning about like what Reconciling Ministries Network was and all of that. And even then, you know, I first had the name of this church in June of 2010. It would take until February of 2011 before I would ever walk through their doors, because I'm like, I see your banner. I see your banner that says that I'm welcome. My old church would gladly tell me I'm welcome to come back there. I need to know that I'm more than welcome. I need to know that I'm safe. And that's the message that I don't know that if they are looking for it, that everyone sees.
Can I ask you a question? Are we
Yeah.
talking about the same church? Are you still a member of the same church? I think you're a member.
Yes.
So Josh's experience and my experience are the same institution.
Well, not the same congregation though.
Not the same. No, not the same congregation. That's
Right.
correct.
But the
The same like church, but I was at the like main campus and
Yeah.
you were at
I'm currently still a member of like Broad Street United Methodist.
Oh, no. Okay, so it's a
Is
different
that what-
church. No, it's a different church.
Not
It's
the
a-
same. No, not the same.
Scrap that.
Not
Scrap
the
that.
same.
Not the
No.
same.
Okay.
Not the same. Not the same.
Like cousins, but not.
Yeah, but not the
Same
same.
denominator.
No.
Same
I mean,
denominator.
honestly, it's not. It's just scrap my whole comment. Scrap it.
I do love the analogy that you made of trying to market something that people aren't looking for, because I think we can see that with younger folks, but queer people specifically, of taking institutions that have created community and been very rigid and very specific in the past, and we've created our own. So there's been a few times where like there have been moments where I look at my friend, I'm like, is this like gay youth group? Because we've created our own communities, we've created our own sanctuaries, whether that is AWOL on a Saturday night, or so spaces where we can have that same sense of community, that same sense of coming together as a congregation. It just is in a different facet. We worship in a different way. And though we might not say that we're worshiping God, but like just reveling in queerness and reveling in authenticity is for me, in the way that I've been able to label it, that's a form of worship, and it's a form of just praising with the universe or whoever for creating us divinely. So as hard as it is to market these spaces, it's not so much that I can't find that queer church that I want to go to. It's like, we've made our own church, and we've made our own path. We've made our own family structures. We've taken these very cis-normative, heteronormative institutions, and we created our own version. So it's not so much that there's a deficit for some of us, it's more of that we filled that deficit with
Yeah.
affirming spaces.
This is, I think, one of the biggest things that churches, faith communities can give folks is community.
Yeah.
And yeah, we found our own ways and places of having community.
Yeah.
So I know we had a question there, but so safe means, I guess, big means that you are not saying, yeah, you can come to our doors, you can be a member of our congregation, but you can't hold like leadership or ministry positions though.
But you can
Or-
be ties.
And we're still going to, we're secretly going to be praying that you see the error of your ways and change, or more dramatically, like, we've got this group for people like you that meets once a week. Maybe this would be, so I guess those ways, like, yeah, like some churches will welcome you in while still believing that somehow, there's an agenda. And I want the church's agenda to be like, how do we help you figure out how to be the best you as you are?
There's also been spaces where there's space for lesbians and gay people, but there's not space for trans people.
Mhm.
So making sure that it's not just a rainbow that we're celebrating, it's the full umbrella of queerness. You can't pick and choose those of us that are worthy. So making sure that it's enveloping everybody.
I think one of the hardest parts, if I think back to my time in leadership and ministry, vocational, occupational ministry, one of the hardest parts is that ministerial leaders are not in control of the things that the members of the congregation say to each other. It's a creation of a culture that makes it more uncomfortable for someone to say something ignorant than it is for someone to keep that to themselves. Because for me, what safe looks like as a trans person and also who's married, and my wife identifies as pansexual, and we have a 5-year-old little girl, is that I don't have to defend or explain something to her that some Sunday school teacher said out of ignorance, or like I have to be able to trust that she can be there, and the things that she will learn will be similar to the things that I would want her to know, and that, until I feel that kind of trust, I don't know that we'll really become members of a congregation again in that way. I might go, she might come with me, but will she go to Sunday school? When we have gone, she does not. She sits with us in the congregation. So it also has to be a place where it's okay for her to sit there and color and make noise and do, be a kid, because I'm not going to send her off to, someplace where I'm not, or I'm going to sit there like a weirdo, creep in the Sunday school class, the 5-year-olds, you know what I mean? Like that, so it has to be, not only is it have to be safe for queer folks, but also there's a lot of components of it that the pastor, so to speak, or the ministry team is not going to be responsible or able to manage in the same way.
Please. I think we may have 4 answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my space as a queer educator, I as one of my responsibilities here is I will go to organizations or businesses and talk about LGBT education. And the definition that we use is queer is an umbrella term. There's an asterisk on that. So one definition that we use is an umbrella term to encompass both gender and sexuality that is not hetero or cisgender. So an umbrella term, but it's also, whenever I'm giving a presentation, I have a list of terminology that I hand out. Some of them are highlighted. Those are caution words, because depending on who you're speaking to, what generation they're from, some people, doesn't matter how much a word is reappropriated, it still holds a lot of pain. So for some folks, so say I'm giving a presentation to my Trailblazers, I will spell out the acronym LGBTQ+ instead of just using the shorthand of queer, because I know that for that population, that word has a connotation that, regardless of how it is affirming for me and how it's been a space that feels good to me, it's not for someone else. So it depends. But for the context of whenever I'm doing education, it's an umbrella term that encompasses both. We're not just saying the gay community, we're saying the queer community. So that way we're covering everybody.
Before we go further, like I can see in the chat, they're asking us to repeat the question. So for that one, the question was, what does the word queer mean? Yeah, and I'm 46. So I'm sort of like on that line. Like when that word first started coming back into circulation, I had a very adverse reaction to that. And now over time, I'm like, okay. I appreciate the fact that others embrace that word. I want them to be able to embrace that word, and I've come to be very comfortable with that word now. But initially, it was like what?
Exactly.
No,
Yeah.
that's one of the things I used to get called in the hallways of high school. No.
Mhm.
Anyway, sorry. There was another question in the back. Yeah.
Those ladies. After that. Now, that is guys already they have same-sex weddings.
Yeah, and the United Methodist Church has been working on this for over 50 years. They've been working on it for a very long time. But you're right, they're in a very different space now where congregations seem to be freer to make their own independent determinations as to what their community is going to do. And yeah, the UCC is very supportive. And what was the other denomination? Episcopal Church? Yeah.
For our viewers at home, that was a brief just praising of the of changes that are happening within both the Episcopal and United Methodist Church, as well as a recollection of a phenomenal person within that ministry. They can't hear anything that you're all saying.
Yeah.
Any questions in the chat?
No questions in the chat. Jaren earlier on was commentating, I think, on the embroidered lake of fire that you're talking about, Josh. Some twisted grandma for love, and it's that embroidered.
Thank you, Jaren.
It seems to me that if churches would focus solely on the gospel, the words of Jesus, instead of Paul's interpretation or Old Testament, things would be better.
I have to praise, and God, I'm using church language now. I just have to testimony about good old Jaren Terry. The fraternity that I joined in Capitol is where I met Jaren's child, Kay. Kay and I have been friends since move-in day freshman year and have come out together both of our levels of queerness. And I'm really grateful for the advocacy that Jaren is still doing today, both within church spaces as well as through programs like PFLAG and Mama Bears. So I'm grateful to be in a space where I looked up to her as like a pseudo mom. And now we're planning events like this Sunday, the Mama Bear screening at the museum. And if you want to learn more, you can talk to me about that after we're done.
Shameless.
Shameless plug. Yeah. And I think it's an opportunity for our congregations to leverage their positions of power. This is a nation that, as much as it has religious freedom, is predominantly Christian-based and prioritized for the priorities of Christians. So I think that this is a space where affirming churches can, instead of asking what the queer community, what they can do to bring queer people in the door, you can advocate for us. You can find spaces where you can leverage your access to make sure that you're advocating whenever there are anti-trans bills or there are anti-queer bills. Use your space, use your leverage. And that's one way that you can demonstrate, not through putting up flags and having a pride sermon, but more of this is what we're doing for queer people.
And if you're a part of a congregation that wants to get more involved with that stuff, like reach out to orgs like Equality Ohio or HRC, find out like how do we get material so that we can be more informed and engaged.
Or Love Boldly.
Or
Love Boldly.
Shameless plug.
Or Stonewall, hire us. Instead of just saying we want to do better, learn what it means to do better. Don't just say we've created space, say we've educated ourselves about what queerness is and how we can be more affirming. Instead of just good intentions, educate yourselves. Hire Equality Ohio or Stonewall or Equitas Health Institute to come in and talk to you about what queerness is, not just with a dictionary definition, but more of the nuances of what it means to interact with queer people and how we can be better stewards to our members of our congregations.
Yeah. When I was at Equality Ohio, I don't know that they're using it as often anymore. I talked to Ben about it previously, but when I was at Equality Ohio, we had I wrote a faith training series essentially for congregations called Becoming Faithfully Inclusive, that walks you from what does it mean to be LGBTQ to why is it important to advocate for the rights of LGBTQ people, and how do you bring your congregation with you, or how do you, if you're a small group of folks within a congregation, how do you encourage others to join you in that advocacy? So I know they still have it. Who's leading it? They don't have a faith organizer right now that I'm aware of. And so I'm not sure who's leading that training series, but they do have it available as part of their plethora of resources. But they will also message you and ask you to come to all the things if I know them at all.
And also, as I can read in the chat, among other things, Jaren Terry is throwing some love back to Zach. But also, if you have like parents within your congregations that would benefit from having some support from, my kid just came out, I don't know what to do with that. Like PFLAG can be a great space for them to get support from other parents. And also, like I've been in their meetings, I've spoken in their meetings. They are great at meeting parents where they are, at whatever level of understanding, confusion, resistance they're at. They are wonderful at kind of helping them come to terms with that, understand what's going on so that they can support their kids.
And Jaren also adds in the chat, my friend Liz Dyer, who founded the Mama Bears, which is made up of over 34,000 affirming moms, talks about the fruit. One way to tell if theology is good or bad is to look at the fruit. Is this tree, in this case being theology, producing people who are fully alive, fully authentic, fully loved and loving? Or is this tree producing broken people who are taught to hate themselves and others, producing self-harm and worse? That's how to tell if a church or theology is good or bad.
Jaren Terry, our fifth panelist.
Yes.
questions from folks who are sitting or with us in person or in the chat? As you're thinking, one thing I would say, I had a conversation recently with a friend who identifies as, well, actually, how she identifies is immaterial, but the thing that she said as a queer Christian is that the church has a moment now. We are seeing more and more legislation throughout the states, federal level, in other countries, and the church really has a chance right now to step up and say something. And yes, I'm using church very broadly to encompass most of Christianity, but individual churches have this moment. The moment has really passed for churches just simply to market better to the queer community. What the church needs to do now is speak out, particularly members of the church, members of clergy, members of professional or volunteer leadership who are themselves cisgender or heterosexual need to speak up, need to speak out about what's going on against our community. I fear, again, speaking as a queer Christian, speaking as someone who would like to see the church do better and do more, I think if the church misses this opportunity, the percentage or the number of queer folks, at least in this country, who are going to still be somewhat interested, at least, in getting involved with the church or getting back involved with the church is going to significantly decline. We already know that many queer folks either don't want that to be involved with the church or are hesitant to be. If the church misses this opportunity for advocacy, we're going to miss our community. And unfortunately, though understandably through history, there is no really solid counter space in Christianity, at least American Christianity, for the queer community. I think Zach said it very well in that the queer community made its churches in gay bars, in those other sort of counter spaces. Whereas if we look at the civil rights movement, for example, the counter space often was the church, and many of the leaders were clergy, at least in the kind of Martin Luther King days of the civil rights movement. That's not the same for the queer community. So again, if the church misses this opportunity, I don't think there's going to be a lot of going back.
I also want to add, as I'm contemplating this, I think what we're asking or challenging churches to do in this moment is to take a risk on our behalf. Quite simply, is to show up to the State House, to issue a letter, to invite a preacher who's a trans person or a gay person to talk about what it means to be. What I say is, I cannot do what God is calling me to do unless I'm willing to be exactly who God created me to be. And nobody else gets to decide who God created me to be. That's between me and God, right? And so the community's job, the church's job, is to look at the fruits and to trust the fruits of whether or not I am leading in that space, and to support and to trust and to guide and to all of those things, right? Help with discernment, but not necessarily to define the types of people that God creates and the types of people that God does not create. But invite somebody to, when I was doing organizational change within the church, there's a difference between a pastor and a preacher. Pastor has to shepherd, protect, comfort. A preacher can come in and say whatever the hell he wants.
Yeah.
And usually there's a strategic move, right? The preacher can come in and say the thing that the pastor wants to say, but is going to be difficult for the congregation to hear from them. And then the pastor come behind the preacher and say, I understand why this is difficult for you to hear. Let's talk about it, right? Let me usher, let me shepherd, let me those things, right? So there are ways, I think, to prepare the church to take the risk, but what we need is what the community needs to see is that the church is willing to take a risk. The leaders in the church are willing to take a risk because the call of the Holy Spirit is too much to not take a risk. And then the other thing I want to add is that we, in addition to taking the risk, recognize that there's two things. One, preparing the congregation is a process in and of itself. That there are folks in the LGBTQ community who cannot go through that with you. There are others who can journey through some of that with you, who can be present, can be a witness, can testify, can do those things. But there are some folks who can't. You're gonna have to. The field's gonna have to be ready. The table's gonna have to be set. And it needs to be a safe one. And the other thing, what was the other thing? It'll come back to me.
I think
I don't know.
part of taking a risk, I think, is also, we've talked a lot about creating space. I think one piece that we forget is within the, using higher ed terms, in terms of the curriculum, don't just highlight stories and interpret them in strictly heterosexual cisnormative ways. Talk about David and Jonathan. Talk about it bluntly. Include those stories not in just a pride series, but talk about them and the biblical relevance of queer people in the Bible. Don't let it just be a special series. Talk about us the same way you're going to talk about Esther and Ruth if you're looking back at the Old Testament. So making sure that you're including us not just in fun ways and in affirming ways, but include us in ways that we've been erased in the actual context of the Bible.
I remember what I was going to say. Thank you. We've talked a lot about and mentioned in different ways that we as a broad community have created other spaces that we call church that fill the void in many ways of having a spiritual community that understands who we are and our journey and our pain and our trauma, but also shares our belief system, oftentimes shares our theologies, and sometimes that is in a gay bar, and those spaces are not scary spaces you can come to. Show up in those places, right? Come and sit and enjoy the drag show. And eventually people might realize you're a pastor. They might be like, hey, I have a question for you. They may be a little drunk when they ask you the question, but they'll ask you the question. And you can respond, right? Like you can be present in the communities that we've created too, just like you want us to be present in the communities that you've created.
But bring singles.
Yeah, do that too.
You need to tap your
Pay your
entertainers. It's just like a collection plate. It's just
It is.
lingering. There it is. I think Eric you had your hand up a while ago. Of course.
Two things. Number one, even in the local church, we let what the market see. That's exactly the kind of that. Now, So we could get at least 15. Stay out in the month of June, we want it not on site, make it at every next conference. We hope we back here.
I don't know, should we recap that?
It's a lot to
It's a
recap.
lot to recap,
Well,
yeah.
well,
There wasn't a question. It was more of just informational and hope for the future.
As I will recap one thing Eric said though. On March 26th at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church at the what time is the service? 10:30 service, possibly the morning service as well. I will be preaching, and I'm really happy that St. Stephen's, which is now one of our Love Boldly church partners as of literally today. Did not plan to announce that here, but
Heard it here first.
I'm really happy to be able to have that invitation to go to speak on and use a biblical verse as part of speaking on LGBTQ folks in the church.
I'd like to add one more thing. I feel like I'm an introvert, so I think about things and then I'm like, oh, I have a comment. So this is related to something that we've been talking about. But I think it's important to also recognize, as I've been sitting here wrestling with what does draw me back to the church. Because I am actually considering, there's a church that I want to go to, and I look at the people, it's a new start in the United Methodist Church. It's called Circle of Hope. And I look at the people who are there and I look at the people who are working there, and I know them for multiple seasons of my life. I went to college with the pastor, and my first roommate is on their board. Someone I've worked with multiple times in nonprofit spaces, just joined their team. Like, I'm like, oh, those are my people. I want to go see them. And I will. And so there is sort of a place for the church that I still long for. And when I think about it, what I miss the most is being with people who like to think about theology. It's an intellectual draw for me. And so I'm not going to say that there's an intellectual draw for lots of folks, but what I want to highlight about that is it's going to be harder for you to have queer people come back to the church because they're queer and you want to welcome them. There's probably going to be something else that some other component of who they are, of who we are, that makes us unique. I don't get that when I'm with my queer community, when I'm with my queer folks. They're my tribe, they're my people, but there's something about church people who can give me something else. I need that space to be somewhat safe. I need it to be a safe place to have those conversations. And we've talked about what safe means, but it's not, if and when you do get us back, one, there's going to be some risk that you have to take, and to prove to us that it'll be okay when we come. And it's also probably not going to be because we're queer and you said we're welcome. It's going to be because of some other component of who we are, an interest that we have. Maybe it's like, I just want to play basketball, or I want to, there's a card game league. My grandma used to play Hand and Foot. I don't know why that's the only card game I can think of right now, but like, if my grandma lives in Tennessee, so I don't get to play Hand and Foot. It's a really hard game for me to teach other people, but if someone was like, we're having a Hand and Foot club, I'd be like, that's cool. I'm not doing anything, like there's probably some other interests, is what I want to make sure you all hear too. There are other interests that we have. If the space is safe enough, if the ground has been prepared, if the table is set enough, that we might come for something else, for someone else.
So to repeat the question for people at home on the subject of safety, understanding that churches are not a monolith and that within a congregation of 500 people, you'll have 500 different opinions. In terms of safety, missed the last part of the question. I was doing so good. What was the last part? I'm writing it down. No, what was the last part? I'm not getting the essence of it. Yes. Mhm. So the last part is understanding if there are 500 different perspectives, how do we create a sense of safety within that? Or is there a way to create a sense of safety because you have 500 different people? I think I got it.
And given the fact that just because the pastor says something doesn't mean
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit, but from my perspective, it's one of the hardest parts from a ministerial leadership perspective is to create a space that feels safe. So for me and for my family, it would be the twofold. One is the culture of the group needs to, I would need to feel that it is discouraged to have a contrary opinion or to at least share it publicly, right? To just walk up, to be a Sunday school teacher and to say, to only ever use examples of men and women as married couples, or to only have white people in your coloring books, or to only have, right? Like it needs to be a place that that Sunday school teacher is going to be challenged to learn about different family structures and responsible for teaching in a way that is inclusive. And that it's not going to be, they're not going to just sneak in some random lesson because that's not the culture of the space. Even if someone may come in and be like, I don't know, I don't really agree with that. Okay, let me and you have that conversation, but let's not have the Sunday school teacher have that conversation. That kind of
Yeah, well, and also like a lot of churches that have taken that step to become like officially affirming, that does a lot of the folks who maybe would not have been okay with that, typically they tend to leave either during or around like after that vote. So it does tend to kind of change sort of the flavor and the personality of the church. Now, I do struggle a little bit with the like I want us as a society to be a space where people can have different opinions. I do want that. I also I don't want people to be afraid to express their views. And selfishly, I do want people to experience a little bit of that feeling of fearing exile because of who they are. I want people, like selfishly, I want them to experience just to feel a tinge of that, of what it feels like to fear that, like, if I'm honest about who I am, I might lose my church community. I might lose my friends. I might lose my family. That feels selfish to say that, but if I'm being honest, I'm okay with people feeling a little bit of that. Yeah.
I think in reference to 500 different opinions, I think leadership can impress upon people kind of like the NTA did a few years ago, see something, say something. If someone says something offhanded, whether it's a Sunday school teacher or just a normal person coming in, if they say something out of pocket, they say something racist, they say something misogynistic, they say something transphobic, don't be afraid to say something. Understand, like, that doesn't uphold the values of this congregation. Just be upfront about it. So even though we're moving into things beyond just what the leadership of a congregation can do, the individual members hold that power to set precedents, to say, this is not okay. We are not going to tolerate, and we're not going to tolerate intolerance. So just being vocal about it as individual members.
I also think you can create spaces for people. I also think it is important that people who are willing to grow and are ready to experience a maybe challenging conversation around what they've been taught. It is also important for them to feel safe enough in some space, to say, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, I am struggling. I want to, there's certain, what I used to, when I was leading the Becoming Faithfully Inclusive series, I would ask churches, if they were at a place where they were still wrestling with whether or not LGBTQ people exist and God created them, or if they're wrestling with what that means and how we live into that. Because if you're still wrestling with whether or not I exist, I can't. I'm sorry. You have to go talk to somebody else. And I had resources where I would say, like, why don't you read this book? Or why don't you have a book study on this? Or why don't you talk to this pastor who I know would be more than willing to help you and feels called to help you through that. But I'm not your person. If you're ready to say, we exist, you exist, God called you to exist, and God created you, but now I don't know what to do about that, and I want to learn more about that, then I can be in that space. My wife can't be in that space. She doesn't want to be in that space, right? She needs a safer space. And then in a small group, or in a, I might choose to join a book study to read some book that, helps process a personal experience. But she's not going to want to be in that space. And I don't want my daughter in that space yet either. Maybe one day, but not at 5. And so having separate spaces for folks to learn and to grow and to challenge and to express genuinely why they aren't sure is also okay. Just not like the traditional like Sunday morning gathering. I don't want to experience there.
I would say talk to your therapist about that. Talk to your therapist about why you think some people don't deserve humanity. That's not predominantly a Christian space. That is a human space. Talk to your therapist about why you think that's okay. Hopefully you're in therapy.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And I would add, particularly to what Alex said, that, as I loved how you worded the question originally, that churches are not monoliths.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing's true of the queer community. We are not a monolith. I have worked with some people through Love Boldly who are perfectly fine with going to churches where the pastor every so often talks about how gay people are going to hell because they really like the music, or that pastor who said they're going to hell is their uncle or whatever. There are people in our community who, because of one thing or another, are going to put themselves in spaces that others of us would not feel safe in. I am a big, tall, white, cisgender man with a beard. I can walk into pretty much any space short of maybe a biker bar, and until I open my mouth, no one's really going to have much of an issue with me. Now, once I open my mouth, all bets are off. And I know this about myself. That is not the same for people who hold other intersectional identities. And we have to remember that piece as well. So I feel fine walking into a space where I know that, hey, the pastor may not be 100% inclusive. Other people, not so much. I also know for myself, though, I could never attend a church, even once, where I know that the pastor doesn't think that I'm human because I'm gay. Sorry, it's not happening. I'm not going in there. And I'm not putting myself into that space. And again, I say that as someone who could go to that space and be perfectly safe. So I would say also remember the queer community is not a monolith, and we need to think intersectionally in our own community and beyond.
Sure.
Well, I feel like, what's that? Oh, yes, I should summarize. Yes, for our online folks. Yeah, so the question is sort of just the recognizing the emotional labor that it takes for queer folks to share our stories and to take the step to put ourselves in a space that may or may not feel safe for us, and whether or not some of that burden should start to be shouldered by others. In terms of, I will say that sharing my story today felt pretty easy. Sharing my story shortly after I came out felt like stepping in front of a firing squad. You know, I've been fortunate to be able to be in spaces where I've been able to share my story many times, and I've gotten comfortable with it. I'm in a space where I feel very safe with people that I feel very safe with. Some churches, congregations that I would go to, and I also would recognize that like I have the benefit of being, you know, a large white bearded cisgender man, and that many times when I walk into a space, I don't cause alarm. I also recognize, especially as a therapist, that when I step into a space, not everyone perceives this as safe, and I try to be mindful of that, because just like all of us, consciously or unconsciously, sometimes whether we should or we shouldn't, we do sometimes write a narrative around someone based on what we see on external factors. So I want to recognize that what's in this frame brings that as well. But yeah, but often when I step into a space, like I know what churches I'm going to. I've done my research. I know what's safe. It's not going to be really so much of a blip on someone's radar. Yeah, I think when we walk into a space and we are perceived as something of a novelty, that does bring an additional pressure and space. And I know like this is something like Alex and I've had conversations about in terms of like how we are people who have put ourselves in those spaces to have those conversations, but not everyone has done that or is comfortable with that. And so just kind of back to the point too, that like we're not a monolith. Not every person who falls under the LGBTQ plus umbrella is going to be comfortable answering questions. So I don't know if any of that helps you or not, but yeah, it is an emotional lift to sometimes just put ourselves in spaces.
I think the piece that I heard was we don't know what we don't know, and sometimes it can be difficult to educate folks on that. And I'm not pushing back because I do think that that is very true. But I do think a lot of queer people have told their stories. I think it's more of on the onus of folks who are curious about it to do whether it's emotional labor or just, to me, reading is a labor. But people have written books, people have podcasts about their lived experiences. So people put it out there, just now listen. So instead of just being like, I don't know, just be like, oh, well, or we carry computers in our pockets now. So just pop it all into Google and see what comes out.
And for anyone I don't really mean this as I didn't come here to plug my own stuff, but a few years ago, Alex and I did do a podcast together, sharing the stories of individuals within the United Methodist faith so that we could like highlight some of those stories. It's called We Are Compatible, because United Methodist language was, I don't know where that stands now, but homosexuality is not compatible with Christian teaching. So
I think someone else at the table has a podcast as well, then.
Yeah, there may be a podcast called The Christian Bear, which I may host, yes. I do want to be cognizant of time. We scheduled this panel to go no later than 12:30, and we are about 9 or 10 minutes from that mark. So I do want to invite anyone as a very much a valid introvert. If there's anyone else who has questions, who maybe has been sitting on a question for a while, I don't want to shut down anyone who's asked more, but if anyone has questions, I just like to give breathing room. Yes, please.
I think that you brought it up a widely known. That obviously, that acknowledgement. So, having church community, what is that like? Sound like how can that be expressed in a way that is satisfying?
Beautiful question. So the question was addressing the harm that the church as a broad term has caused folks. What does reconciling that look like at both a macro level as well as a micro level with individual people? Did I do a good job? Great.
I think sorry to jump in, but I think from a macro level, and I'll kind of stand there. I think part of it is that churches, and I wish we could see this more at the denominational or the kind of overarching level, but churches themselves can say, look, we acknowledge in our own history, in our own congregational history, where we have and have not stood up for the queer community. I think those statements, though they are a starting point only, are a good starting point, particularly for churches that may have some baggage or or may have really not lived into their call to accept and affirm the queer community, again, as a congregation itself. I speak from some personal experience here leading Love Boldly, which until about 1.5 years ago was centrist to conservative leaning and was very allied led. Not that allies are a bad thing by any means, but we have had to do some work about saying, hey, in the past we have shown up not as queer affirming or not queer affirming period, as we want to be, as we have wanted to be, for a variety of reasons. So I think churches can start there by just publicly admitting, hey, it may not have been us, it may not have been our congregation as it's assembled today, it may not have been the pastors who are on staff today, but we've messed up, we haven't done this. I think, and then I think the church has to take, again, from a macro level, congregations have to take some action on that. It's not enough to just say we're sorry. We need to do something more. Though the topics are apples and oranges, it relates to how we address racism or how we address classism in our congregations. And let's face it, white American Christianity has failed terribly when it comes to racism. As Dr. King said, Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. So in the same way, from a macro level, churches then need to put some effort into fixing some of the problems, fixing some of the issues in their congregation, in their denomination. Whether that be, hey, we've shown up for gays and lesbians, but we haven't shown up for our trans siblings. We haven't shown up for our pansexual or bisexual siblings. We haven't shown up wherever else. Showing up for those folks, at least in the confines of their congregation.
I think within apologies and within statements, I think including some specifics. So pointing on how things have changed, not just saying like the sentiment of we've changed, more of this was a policy we had. This is what the policy was. We don't agree with this anymore. Here's how we've changed that. So that way for the logistical people, not just the emotional people, they can read, here's logistically how things have changed. Here's what it used to be. Here's what it is now.
And I would say put that in a space that people can see it before they get there.
Yeah. Accessible.
You can also do things like, not to be, I think this would be like something that I would recommend for a church who's kind of new to the desire to like move the congregation in this direction, is to be really intentional around June, what your sermon series looks like. And this year may not be the year that you stand up and give a apologetic, and I don't mean like that kind, but you know what I mean, sermon, so to speak. But Maybe next year is. Maybe this year is the year that we kick off we're gentler. Maybe we're a little more gentle this year with the congregation in June, but maybe next year we push them a little further. I think I'm gonna put this out there as a general offer. I have at Equitas Health in particular led a team of folks who have really needed a trauma-informed approach to their new leadership. You can read the news as to why, but October 2021. Anyways, Columbus Dispatch. But they've needed a really trauma-informed approach to how new leadership engages. And I think trauma-informed practice on a micro level is important, so that when I think individual practitioners, parishioners, individual people in the church should have some understanding of the trauma they may receive, the trauma response they may receive, and how to respond to that trauma in a way that assists in the healing process and does not perpetuate that trauma. On a macro level, making the apology. And I've spent most of my career working around organizational culture change. And so if I could be of any help to anybody in this space, I'd be happy to. But that's what it is. I mean, it's broad organizational culture change. And if you're part of a denomination that does not want you to make this change, there's a whole other level of how you do that and what you put on your website and what you say on Sunday and why they're different. So if I can be of help as we're getting closer to the end here, please let me know.
I just want to tack on to that real quick. I had this thought like back when you were talking about the 500 members, 500 different perspectives. A person could be turned off if they have a really negative experience with a single employee at Target, right? It could turn them off that store, it could turn them off the entire chain. The way Target and other large organizations is through training, and resources. So yeah, so through I would argue congregations could take a similar approach, just as has been suggested. Like, what trainings can we make available to parishioners, and so that they know how to respond in situations. No, we're at,
Do we have any chat questions?
yeah, I saw.
We don't have any questions from the chat.
A lot of
just,
thoughts.
Yeah, lots of reflections, words of affirmation, agreement, with a lot of what the panel is saying, but no questions.
Warriors.
And I don't know about my other, I don't plan on bolting out the door the minute this is over either, so we can linger if there are other questions.
Why don't we go to, is this a good stopping point, my friends?
Sure.
Why don't we, for those of us here thank you to our folks online. For folks here in person, we will be here for a while. If you have questions for any of us individually,